in large part, I'd like to introduce my center, the Center for Space Exploration Policy Research, with Bob Frodeman at the University of North Texas, and Gene, you're also a contributor. This is an organization that has been put together to discuss these kinds of things, the societal implications of space exploration. And I'd like to suggest that in this new era of possible rapid expansion into space with commercial activities and more space-faring nations, that that global issues associated with going into space that will be important. And the current, as you probably know, the current U.S. military doctrine is to take the high ground. And I'd like to suggest as a framing issue for the next couple days what the implications of that might be for the kinds of things that we're envisioning for space and how it will influence our lives in the next decades. So this is what I'll probably be bringing up. Bob Frodeman, the other organizer, would like to say a word.
Can I ask a question?
And Chris McKay. Yes.
For those who are just here for a couple of talks, they're not registered, are there any additional copies of the program?
We'll make them. Yeah. Bob.
Whoa, careful. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Gene. I'd just like to add two small points. Maybe an additional layering or another perspective to what's been already said. Several of us involved in this workshop come from a background in philosophy, in particular environmental ethics, and part of what has motivated Gene to put together the first and maybe still only monograph on the environmental ethical issues concerning outer space was the sense that nature does not stop at the stratopause. And so there's a sense there should be some kind of linkage between sublunary and superlunary perspectives. And so that's a point worth emphasizing. Second, part of what we work on at the University of North Texas is what we call the theory and practice of interdisciplinary research and pedagogy. And so in a sense, these questions of space science, policy, and environmental philosophy is another case study in a continuing series of case studies in how do you do interdisciplinary work, how do you create interdisciplinary and indeed transdisciplinary working groups, how do you cross across those divides of background and language and training. And so hopefully we'll have a chance to highlight those perspectives as well over the next couple days. Thank you.
And Chris, you're also supposed to speak.
Right.
He's our local coordinator.
Okay, I want to say just a few things about the logistics. One is those lights are really bright, aren't they? The second thing is we've arranged for all of you to have access to the wireless here, and there's usernames and passwords, and there's a list with it, and I think Mark has the list. Gene also has the list, and I have it on my computer. The second thing is that I wanted to say is that this is a small workshop, even though we have a big room, but because we have a big room, I sent an email around to many people at Ames saying that they could come and listen to a lot of the talks. So there'll be people coming in and out who are interested, because it is an interesting topic. The other logistical issue is on Thursday night we'll have a dinner at Chef Chu's, and I'll have a van that people who are allowed to rent a car or don't want to drive to Chef Chu's can ride with me in the van. Anything else you can think of in terms of organizational?
I can say something else.
Okay, taking off my organizational hat. Oh, if you have any problems, you need something, come to me first, and then I'll tell you I don't know, but I'll tell you who does know. So I'm happy to be the point of contact for logistical problems, or if you need something printed or whatever. But taking off my organizational hat, putting on my work hat, which is I've been, as many of you know, pushing for many years for NASA to take on human exploration of Mars. They decided to take on human exploration of the moon first. So for a few days I pouted But then I decided, well, that's not going to do any good. So I decided to put my shoulder to the wheel and help push. And so now I'm involved with pushing and helping human exploration become a reality. I think discussion, once humans go to other worlds, Mars in particular, a lot of the issues that we've discussed somewhat academically before in terms of ethics and environmental stewardship, of dealing with life on other planets, dealing with the concepts of taking life to other planets, become very concrete and very real. And so I think it's very timely to be reconsidering that, and I'm personally very excited to be involved in that discussion. All right.
I suppose a couple of other things might be that we've lost two speakers. First of them was Peter Diamandis, who never totally committed to coming, and then it turned out that he had conflicts, and then finally couldn't even remember that he had tentatively planned to come, and even though we showed him an email where he said that. But anyway, we then tried to find some other people, and I made some effort until it got really embarrassing because it was getting so close to the conference. And so I moved Bill Hartman into tonight to start the program off a little better. And then we don't actually have a talk after dinner tomorrow night, so we just go. And then the other person, Brenda Ward, substituted a person named Brett Drake, who then sent an email last night who said that he had strep throat and wasn't coming. And Chris McKay is looking for somebody here who could also talk about the Mars mission. How's it going, Chris?
How about you, Chris?
Right. Failing that, I will talk. After that also, I figured 2 hours of Chris McKay is an hour and 59 minutes too much.
Will be our privilege.
Mm-hmm. So it turns out that we successfully, starting a half an hour late, are only 8 minutes late now. So our first speaker is Clark Chapman, who is a senior scientist at Southwest. What? Oh, excuse me. Oh, I was going to save a whole hour there. I get mixed up sometimes. Okay, George Whitesides. He's the executive director of the National Space Society. He began his career at Orbital Science Corporation, Zero Gravity and Corporation, and Blastoff Corporation. He is an appointed member of the of ComStack on space transportation issues for the Department of Transportation, and he's a co-founder of Yuri's Nights and optional activity at the end of this conference, and which I didn't mention, but since if you can't get out of town, then you can go to Yuri's Nights with some of us. So George Whitesides.
Sure. Let's see here. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. No, it's meant to be green. I figured since it was environmental conference, I should put in something green. I am George Whitesides, and I am the Executive Director of the National Space Society. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today, and I really enjoyed thinking about what I would say at this event, and I enjoyed the conversations that I had with Gene over the last few months as he sort of thought and planned this event. I have had a long interest in this general subject, although maybe not framed in the exact way that Gene has thought about it. And so it was really fun to read the wonderful book that we were given, and to sort of wade into the discussions that had happened, you know, fairly horrifyingly, probably a long time ago, you know, in whatever it was, 85, 86. And to sort of think through, where are we now? And so I thought I would, I started thinking about that, and I wanted to sort of share those thoughts with you. And I should probably give a little bit more background before I go there. I am 33, and I sort of have this general sense that there's this interesting shift going on in the space community, and I think it's to a certain extent represented quite well by what's going on here at Ames in general, where you have some really interesting people doing, some young people doing some really interesting things, and it's sort of a, perhaps in a way, a sort of a generational change. And so I think it's very interesting to see how these issues are, how they strike us in this year, you know. So I'll begin, and I have to apologize that I don't have a lot of pictures in this. Normally I have a ton of pictures in all my presentations, but I went about doing this presentation by basically writing down a bunch of ideas, and I didn't really know how to present those. Sort of cut this into various pieces of text, and so I'll sort of page through this, you know, and maybe, you know, ideally we'll look more at each other than at the screen, you know, and we'll see how that goes, and maybe even we'll have a little discussion at the end. So let's talk about planetary ethics and why it's important now. Here's my sort of main point here. I think it's a really important, the phrase really important almost doesn't give it justice. I think it's an incredibly important moment for humanity, this sort of great branching point before we head out to the stars. The National Space Society was founded, you know, under the idea of promoting ideals related to a spacefaring civilization, and I deeply believe that, you know, we're really on our way. And so this is a sort of a critical moment in time for us to be thinking about these issues, because I believe that they will have an impact not for years or decades or even centuries, but I think that we will sort of begin to imprint whatever ethical system that we choose or don't choose into space with our decisions over the coming years. So that's sort of the general direction that I'm coming at. Basically, in a nutshell, now is important, and we need to be very thoughtful about what we're doing. The issue at stake in my mind is sort of is the idea of expanding the scope of ethical consideration to planetary and subsequently interplanetary scale. You know, I think we're obviously starting to adopt that. And I'll talk more a little bit about that shortly. Obviously, this is a very important time because our existing ethics, as I think currently practiced, aren't working. And that's obvious, I think, to everyone. And I thought that Gene's point in your introduction to the book was right on, that, you know, in the simplest construction of the problem is we don't want to create an environmental debacle of greater scope than the one that we've got going on here on Earth. So what I'm going to do in this talk is sort of divided into two different pieces, and I'll summarize the first piece here, and then we'll go through in more detail the second piece. What I thought would be useful for a talk at the beginning of such a conference would be to review, in short, where we are now and what sort of happened over the last 20 years. I actually am curious, how many of you were at the original conference? Oh, two or three? Yeah. Obviously, there were several familiar names in that. And so I think it's relevant and useful to sort of think through what's changed first, and then to sort of go through the various pieces of why it all matters. you know, I believe, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, that the rules and regulations that we establish are sort of the first step towards the establishment of identity, and that we will be sort of imprinting a new identity on space, and that's going to be very hard to shift as time goes on. So we need to think very carefully about it. You know, why now? And I'll get to this stuff in a little bit. So first, let's talk about what's new. And so some of us were here 20 odd years ago, and I thought it would be useful to sort of talk about this in two different pieces. One in terms of the human dimension, what's changed sort of just here with us on Earth, and then what's changed in space. First, some obvious ones. Environmental ethics is now mainstream for a variety of different reasons. So that's one. Two, our ability to manipulate the environment increases dramatically, continues to increase dramatically, and we can already obviously affect planetary scale environmental change. I think soon we will be able to affect intentional large-scale planetary change, and those are very important issues. Part of that will be how we connect in with the construction of both nanotechnology and biotechnology. The other change, of course, is, I think, youth, and I mentioned this before. I think that my perception is that there's a shift going on both on a global scale, but also very specifically inside young spacers. Nationalism is really not an appealing theme to them. I don't know if it ever was, but it certainly is not now. Environmental is. Globalism, or sort of a global identity, absolutely is sort of the watchword of the new generation, and specifically of the new generation of space people. And I think that that's going to be a very important trend, because these will be the people who are inculcating these ideas as they bring them forward into space, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Now let's talk about space, what's changed. Tourism is obviously one of the biggest issues. I should say that I have a personal interest in this, and that I've bought a couple of tickets on Virgin Galactic for my wife and I. And I think that space tourism will have a tremendously powerful impact on our relationship with the Earth and with space. What we're going to have is basically a segment of the global leadership, or the leadership of our world, starting to go into space and experiencing the overview effect in one phrase. And I think that that will have a very powerful cumulative effect on how the rest of the planet starts in space. And so I think that this is going to be a very important issue. An interesting thought that I know that we've talked about in the context of the other Virgin people is the idea of trying to take an intentional sort of look at this by starting to create ethics within this new community, this new population of spacefarers, if you will, where these people who are arguably the first people who are intentionally or deciding by themselves to go into space, that there's a sort of a power to that, and that they may well be able to begin to imprint their own ideas about why they're going into space. Well, I think that's a very sort of powerful idea. Chris mentioned NASA's plans give the issues of environmental ethics an immediate relevancy. The lunar outpost, I think, will be a crucible for space ethics, providing a laboratory in which we can sort of consider the choices that we're making in space and on Earth. Nuclear generators, green propellants, many other issues, even governance, different things. This will be, I hope, a really interesting place to start thinking through this stuff. And what I think that this community needs to do is to inculcate or inject ideas from your community into the discussions. And I look forward to hearing over the next couple of days what level of success you've had with that so far. Obviously, the senior levels of NASA leadership are always very on building the rocket, but maybe not thinking through what the rocket causes. And so I think this is obviously a very important issue. The military space test of China is a big deal and has reinvigorated, I think, quite unfortunately, an active debate in Washington about space-based weapons, whether active or passive. And so this is a that we're going to have to be looking at. And then, of course, exobiology, things that Penny and Chris know far more about, and I look forward to hearing more about that. But I think the reality of this is makes this very relevant for us. And finally, extrasolar planets, which is a personal passion of mine, I think in the long-term sense underlines the far future for humanity, that we do have a universe of planets and that that's where we're heading. And of course, there is the ever-present issues of space settlement. I think my perception is that space settlement has sort of faded a bit from the popular culture, at least in relation to the level of passion, maybe, that was held in the 70s. But I think the new plans and space tourism may well reinvigorate some of those ideas. Okay, so that was sort of a review of what's new. And I'm sure that many of you who are sort of experts in these various aspects will be giving more concrete or detailed looks into each of those, and I look forward to hearing them. What follows now is sort of my take on why this moment matters so much and why it is so critical that we as a community who care about these issues work very hard to make the rest of the world, political leadership, understand the gravity of this moment. We are, as a species, I think, quite ill-suited to recognizing perhaps the gravity of the moment, and yet we need to, I think, change that for this area. Where we're going, we're at a branch point, and we will be feeding ideas that we start now into the species as they spread out. And we need to be sort of cognizant of how this all plays out. The issue of identity, I think, is a very important one. I think about this very much in the context of weaponization. And there's a strong community of folks who are thinking about these issues. And the Chinese test has sort of given things more immediacy, but they've been thinking about it for a while, and I'm sure many of you are part of that community. But the issue is, what are the ethics that we feed into space, and how does that play forward? And what I perceive is this sort of tumble down from rule to identity, where we set up standards, and over time those become sort of the identity of the space, so to speak. And I think that that is what is beginning to happen in space now. Because identities become so hard to change. We have an amazing opportunity to put forward an identity that we want for the rest of human history. And, I'm not sure people really think about that or realize that, but I feel that very much in our work at the Society, that the ideas that we're feeding into space now will have an impact for millennia, and we should act accordingly. I recently went to Egypt last month and gave some talks there. By the way, the Egyptians are very into exobiology. I don't know why, but for various reasons, I'm sure. But and when I give talks, I try to emphasize the perspective here. And from my perspective, it's obviously the old kingdom was about 3000 BC, and roughly speaking, and I care very deeply, as I know you do, about where we will be in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years out. We will be around, and what are we at that point, and what are the ideas and philosophies that we follow at that point? I was amazed by how little we had changed in those years, and depicted on the walls of the Egyptians. I hope that that's not the case in the next 5,000 years. Another very important issue, I think, is the feedback of the frontier to us at home, and and I know that many of you have sort of developed these ideas as well. To a certain extent, what we may well come back and influence how we live on Earth, and the sort of the old saw that each frontier develops a new right or ideal. I think that could very well be sort of a concern for the environment, just by dint of the facts of life in space. And obviously the shift on Earth has already started, but I think that having a moon base and developing a lunar outpost and a lunar colony and eventually Mars bases will underline some of these issues for the people back on Earth. And I think that effect could be tremendously powerful. Chris mentioned the word stewardship, and I think it's a very well chosen and important word. The way I think about stewardship is that we are the first evolved defense of the biosphere against space-based threats. Sort of the, I don't want to homorphize this too much, but sort of the machine of evolution has struggled for years to figure out some way to stop an asteroid, and it finally has. And so I think, and of course other threats, I think that there is clearly a genetic responsibility of humanity, whether we choose to take up that mantle, I think to be seen. But the idea is basically that in really simple terms, we are sort of the defender of the biosphere, and it's our job to protect the Earth. But then the sort of other side of that, of course, is the spreading of life, and I look forward to sort of hearing more about that during our the idea that the greatest moral task is sort of the expansion of the biosphere, ideas that Kim Stanley Robinson expounded in his series. Another important idea about why now is that already trade-offs are occurring between space and Earth. And so it's not like this is a future discussion. We recently published an article in our magazine about using the moon to do the activities that you don't want done on Earth, the most dangerous, the most potentially damaging to the biosphere, you know, advanced nanotechnology, the gray goo, AI, other things that you sort of put this far away. And you know, I think that this is an interesting. Yeah, I started thinking about it in the context of light pollution, which my wife reminded me was a renewable resource. But our ignorance, I think, of this choice is sort of an interesting signal for where we're headed, which is to say, you know, ignoring the pollution of unwanted or unvalued environments until we sort of realize something that we want to value. I think, and obviously the main point is sort of degrading space for the benefit of Earth. But the thing about light pollution, of course, that's so insidious is that it's not just bad for our telescopes, but it's sort of sapping our will to explore. So I think that there are you know, when you don't have that sky out there to remind you that that there's a universe out there, and greater and greater numbers of kids are growing up without that experience, that this exerts almost sort of a you know, a societal-wide effect. So we're closing in on the end, but I want to sort of go through some conclusions with you. And before I do, I sort of thought I would recalibrate what I mean by a planetary ethic. Obviously, there's been a lot of academic writing on planetary ethic, and mostly in the context of Earth. My interest is in the conception of Earth as a system, and eventually the solar system as a system. That's the sort of context from which I'm coming from. And I thought that this quote from sort of captured it for me, which was, when viewed as a planet with a complex, interlaced ecosphere, hard-pressed, that's by 5 billion human beings, the world becomes the central criteria against which images of the future are measured. And that, to me, is really part of the essence of it. Let's think through how we would design something if we were being intentional about it and we realized sort of the gravity of the task at hand. We need to design guiding principles that take into account of what we know about ourselves as humans, first of all. And I think here the issues of timescale and sort of baseline creep, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide, are absolutely critical. And some of these other issues, how we act, how we think about our capabilities. Timescale, this is just one example, and I know that we'll have many different ideas about this sort of general subject about how we intentionally design a planetary ethic. But as I got to thinking about it, and I'm sure that many of you have thought or written about this issue, we're fundamentally unsuited to dealing with environmental problems because we re-baseline every time we're born. And that's sort of a bad from the perspective of long-term changes. You know, I'm not particularly wound up about how different we are from 1700. I'm wound up about how different we are from 1970. And so, you know, if we acknowledge that, we have to think about sort of, well, what do we do about that? You know, and this is what I mean about sort of the intentional design of a planetary ethic, a new planetary ethic, something that is intentional and that is realistic. this was just some thoughts that, you know, what do we do? And the bottom point here that, you know, if we know that each generation will get used to the previous generation's sort of degeneration of the environment, we may well bias towards stricter rules. And I think the obvious sort of issue here is, you know, probably not going to be able to do much on Earth, but maybe we can really focus our thoughts on space. And this was an interesting conclusion to me because I'm very much pro-settlement, and I want us to go out and settle the universe. But we have to think carefully about how we do it if we acknowledge that each generation is only going to know at a deep level its own world or its own lifetime. So sort of to conclude with a few last slides, do we need a planetary ethic? Yes, because we are now developing sort of how we're going to live as citizens of the universe. Space is going to be sort of the crucible in which we develop that ethic. We need to do it now, and of course we started, whether by intent or abdication. The key linkage for me is expanding sort of an Earth-centered conception to that of a space-inclusive conception, as many of you have written about. And we need to take account of sort of realistic issues as we go forward of humanity itself. We have a genetic imperative to protect the planet. I think our responsibility is less clear, but you know, our growing appreciation of these spaces, and this is something that received a lot of attention in the last conference, I know, may suggest sort of ways forward. I think we're going to eventually appreciate our home solar system in its entirety. Planetary ethic will acknowledge that the metric of value is at least planetary scale. Whether that makes a lot of difference, you know, this is something that I look forward to sort of discussing with you. Humans are limited in their life space and lifetime perspective, and that it really is our sort of genetic heritage to protect the Earth. Regulation, rules, and laws will lead to identity, which becomes hardwired over time, so we need to be careful about how we go forward. These rules may well impact the Earth over time. Space tourism, I think, provides the immediate best chance to start inculcating these ideas on a mass level. And I think Loretta and I will sort of start putting forward ideas about pledges that people could take as they go forward, sort of a non-governmental protocol or even treaty. And of course, the NASA's and international partners, Moonbase, will be you know, the first main crucible of this. Space offers the opportunity to reshape our conception of ethics for Earth and space, sort of the reverse insemination of ideas from the frontier to the homeland, and the choices we make in space may well be shaping our future on Earth. And I'll close with this, which is, you know, perhaps we can grow up. I thought this was one of the most wonderful lines. Bryn put it, thinking these things through at least in part before we engage in the activity. Are we growing up at last when we start asking about the hidden costs before embarking on a great venture? Thank you very much. I can do it. Yeah.
I'm curious about this idea that the ethics brought to space by the first space people will then become the ethics of space people for millennia. I don't doubt your conclusion that this is an important time and that we should really think this through. But I'm wondering, you know, for instance, is there historical precedent? Do the ethics of the first people that left America, is that now the ethics that our global society has, or are there? Can you tell me why you think this is true?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, You know, it's an interesting point. I don't know what the ethics were of people immigrating from Africa, you know, 70,000 years were. But what we do see, of course, is that with the settlement of America, that these ethics were inculcated, and inculcated deeply. You know, you read de Tocqueville, and there's very little change. And so I think certainly with frontiers over the last few hundred years, you see, you know, substantial evidence. Now, of course, it's not going to be clean, you know, and as we'll have different groups going out and different ideas, different experiments being tried. But I don't think we should underestimate the power and the import of the first folks. And in particular, I think I would be most interested, well, actually, I'm not sure that that's true. I was going to say I'd be most interested in sort of the private spacefarers. But the government may well have equal power of influence. But I'd be interested to hear what you think as well. Yeah.
Well, this is a very unprofessional opinion, but surely much of ethics today is derived from religion, and much of the world is following religious principles that were developed a couple of thousand years ago for very small tribes of people living in very different environments.
A very good point. Dr. Lewis.
George, I spent last year as a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, making contact with the space science community in China, such as it is. It would all fit in the front row in this room. And the space engineering community, which is much larger. And it seems to me that the attitudes and the prerogatives and the interests of the people of China and India are going to be extremely important factors in whatever resolution we work out. Let me remind you what the ethic is in China right now. To modernize their society, they need industrialization. Industrialization means inventing primary production, which is the most polluting, most environmentally damaging stage in the development of an economy. Developing primary production means exploiting energy resources. Exploiting energy resources means being good friends with the Middle East while the oil lasts, but looking forward to digging soft coal by the millions of tons. They see the entire economic future of their country as being dependent upon exploiting those energy resources. I gave talks there about solar power satellites, about energy from space, about helium-3 from the moon and from the outer planets, about energy sources. I gave a whole variety of talks on basic scientific issues. Guess what they were interested in? Energy. Energy. Any kind of solution that we might anticipate or aim toward has to accommodate the desires of the majority of humanity to join the modern world, to have a much higher standard of living, to have much lower infant mortality, better expectations for education, and so on. Where's the wealth going to come from to save them from a fate of peasantry for the rest of their lives? That's the big ethical issue that is central to most of the world.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I found it, John, quite interesting that and a lot of the rhetoric that you hear, and you don't hear a lot, but you hear some coming out of individuals within the Chinese space science community, you know, that one of their primary interests is helium-3 on the moon, you know, that you hear that at a very senior level.
In Japan, too.
In Japan, too, yeah. And so I think you're absolutely right, that for those countries that will be essential.
If I can just encapsulate all this in a phrase, they see the solution to environmental problems as being a consequence of increased wealth. And they find that the transition from an agrarian society to a primary production society to a secondary production society to a service economy as being something that they would like to shortcut. They would like to tunnel through that mountain somehow. They don't know how to do it. But cheap, clean energy supplies would be the key to saving the planet an enormous amount of environmental damage.
Chris?
we've got a question mic now. He's got it right there.
Okay, I'm sorry. You've got the mic.
I've got the mic. I just have two minor clarifications, revealing my ignorance. I don't know who Brin is, who you're quoting, and what is Virgin Galactica?
Two great. Brin is David Brin, who is a, well, he wrote a chapter in Gene's book, and he's also a well-known science fiction author, among other things, an astronomer and scientist. Yeah, fantastic guy. Virgin Galactic is a project of Richard Branson, which is designed to basically bring people, customers, on suborbital tourism spaceflight experiences.
I just got a request that speakers who ask questions identify, give their names before they ask a question.
Sounds good. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Bob Frodeman, University of North Texas. Thanks for an interesting and provocative survey of a lot of the issues that we want to talk about in the next couple days, in the next couple of decades, certainly. I'd like to emphasize one point right here at the outset that I found particularly provocative. You emphasized that we may be at the edge of making decisions that could be portentous for decades or centuries or even millennia. That sounds right to me, and so we need to be careful in the work that we're doing. And I suggest that one place that the humanists in society and the humanists in the room might be able to help sharpen our conceptual tools is in encouraging us to think about this term ethics, or ethic, planetary ethic. My own sense, coming out of a background in environmental ethics, and Gene Hargrove may not feel the same about it, but is that environmental ethics, by describing the value dimension of our interests in the natural world in terms of ethics, we have badly miscast what we're really interested in. As I said last night in Denver in a talk, who goes to the Grand Canyon for ethical reasons? Now, yes, there are deep and profound ethical dimensions in our relationship in the world, most obviously with animal rights. But if we're going to give an account of the values dimensions, the axiological dimensions of our relationship with the natural world, and I think this really gets to the heart of the matter, if we're going to solicit the interest and support of the public, I think it's imperative that we move beyond the language of ethics, which in today's culture turns into a discussion of rights and possibly responsibilities. And we need to expand this beyond an environmental ethic to an environmental philosophy, where we would especially emphasize issues of metaphysics and aesthetics and theology. Now, all these terms have been crossed out for over 100 years in this culture, and it will be difficult to retrieve them. But when people look at, that shot from Apollo 8 of the Earth against the inky blackness, the feelings that are solicited are not ethical feelings necessarily, but feelings of beauty and awe and transcendence and wonder. And I'm wondering whether, if we're going to talk about some kind of spacefarers code, we need to find some way to widen the conversation, to get people to not simply feel rights and obligations, but to feel love and passion for this, for the tasks and the challenges that lie before us.
I think it's really wonderful. I agree. And then I know Chris had a comment a couple of months ago.
Kelly from astrobiology.com. How's that? On the last comment, but also some of the earlier ones, the people who went to do these things, they're always the ones that set the rules, whether it's ethics or whatnot. You look at any charter of any ship that ever, you know, not, let's say the past 500 years. When they came to Plymouth, what were they doing in the harbor before they landed? I mean, they come up with some ground rules that may be more developed than others. In some cases, it was always a public-private partnership, and the Crown or whoever paid the trip said, you're going to go do this, that, and that, you're under common law or whatever. But without exception, it took longer in some places than others. The people who went and did this accepted or discarded the rules as they saw fit in the environment. And with all due respect to the previous speaker, it may be well that we would want to have an ethos that is humanistic and is inclusive and so forth, but to try and suggest that we need to do this before we go, this is going to happen regardless of what any of us do or think in this room. It'd be nice that we raise these issues as this is happening to remind people that they're human, but they're the ones who are going to be making these decisions, and I guess all we can do is have some good talking points for them. I think it's naive to think that we're going to somehow, you know, it's just the nature of exploration. You go, oftentimes you leave because you want to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And actually that's why I sort of, I absolutely agree. And that's why I emphasize the points about sort of youth. And now, you know, it may not be today's youth that settles Mars, but I think the changing perspective of young people who are interested in space, to me, gives some hope that, you know, and that's a personal perspective, that, you know, these are the folks I think who will be going out there. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the first people on Mars, at least I hope, you know, went to ISU or something like that, you know, and but yes, they'll decide. Good point. Chris? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Lauren Fletcher from NASA Ames, one of Chris's lackeys and whatever he needs done. I think the important thing to think about here is that space ethics as we understand it, or if we go back to 500 years, which was the point I was going to make, is that in the original exploration, when you started with Columbus, followed by Cortez and Pizarro, these were driven by governments had the money to make the initial investment to really put out the exploration and the development of the environment, all driven by greed, all driven by you know, political and economic drivers. But then as you get later on into our history, especially in the Old West, that's driven by explorers who are looking at homesteading. And that's going to, I think, going to be one of the most important things that we're going to have to consider is that you're going to have to look at cheap access to space is going to be the divider. Is it going to be governments? Going to be really cheap so that anybody can do it. If it's anybody out there, then you need to start thinking about developing some sort of a spacefarer's code. If it's only governments who are really being the major drivers, then you have to start thinking about how is this community going to be trying to drive the governments to establish some sort of an ethical policy that is appropriate for the type of exploration that we're doing at the moment. So in your experience, how would you propose drafting ethical policies to really push the governments as well as developing a longer term homesteading sort of policies in putting all that together, if by some miraculous case we come up with some sort of technology that allows anybody to go to space at any time, which of course we're all hoping for.
I think you see already a pretty interesting range of entities that are exploring space or even going into space. You know, we'll have hopefully within 5 years Virgin Galactic and others, Rocket Plane Kistler, other groups that are doing private space travel on a suborbital basis, and that'll be one thing. I was in Colorado Springs yesterday and heard Robert Bigelow give a really interesting talk on his plans for the future, and Robert, for those of you who don't know, is the guy who's trying to build private space habitats in orbit. And he unveiled his business strategy, and he's going to be selling to governments that don't have astronaut programs currently. That's his mark. And so that's another interesting sort of interstitial, a group that doesn't necessarily have its own programs yet, but will. And then, of course, you have NASA and the larger agencies. My point is that I think we'll have this sort of range of different entities working, and there will be different strategies for each of them. You know, I think it's fairly straightforward for, you know, on Virgin to decide that they want to declare something together, or folks going on Rocket Plane Kistler or something like that. the bigger the entity, the harder this will be. But I think having the top-down change in how people think about the environment at a top level, I mean, certainly if a Democrat wins the next presidential election, you can be sure that these issues will be on the front of their mind in the context of the vision for space exploration. And so, you know, I don't sure how to answer your question, but I think it's a good one, and maybe we can work on it a bit together here. Chris.
Yeah, Chris McKay at NASA Ames. Trying to follow up on your suggestion that tourism could be the next step after governmental sponsored organizations. And I think that's a good assessment, and we see that in Antarctica. And Antarctica was originally government-sponsored expeditions, and now tourism is growing. And my question is, how does the tourism we see in Antarctica provide a model, or can we use it as a model? There, at least, the tourism appears to be following a ecologically sound approach, an approach that's consistent with the Antarctic Treaty and stewardship of the Antarctic.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I'm sure, Chris, that you know far more about it than I do, but so I think I'll just leave it at that. I think it's a very good point.
If I may, or was her hand up first? Go ahead. Okay. Paul Davis from here at Ames. You were talking about the difference between governmental versus private, but that does not seem to me to be the big difference, because a private entity is still going to have a lot of people involved in it. And I think the big difference would be a global agreement as to how to do it versus nations, corporations, and individuals doing it in competition with each other. And each of those has disadvantages. I wonder if you could comment, though, on the possibility of a worldwide coordinated effort as opposed to separate national, corporate, or individual efforts.
Yeah, I'm always a believer in the possibility of the smaller granularity efforts, but I take your point. I mean, I think in an ideal world it would be nice to come to a meta agreement about these things. And to a certain extent, the fairly wide ratification of the Outer Space Treaty, you know, was a step towards that. Whether such a thing would be possible in this context now is unclear to me, but it may be that as more nations become enfranchised in space and have their own programs, I think you do see, you know, in COPUOS and other entities, sort of, you know, that there is some consensus of these issues. The non-ratification of the Moon Treaty, I think, was, you know, largely based on sort of one or two problematic pieces, but the rest of it actually is sort of, I would say, maybe a step towards what you're talking about.
One more question.
Sounds good.
Wanda Davis, NASA Ames. I wanted to draw your attention to the role that communication and visibility has in this question. Both to Antarctica and also our views of other planets. I know I've thought a lot about our exploration, and I've been thinking that I'm approaching it as a planetary ethicist. And yet, I have to say that I had a bit of a shudder when I saw the rover tracks on Mars, because there was this beautiful, pristine planet that I'd seen my whole life as this wind-swept thing with maybe a ship or two on it. And now I saw these tracks moving across it. And that brought to my mind two things. First of all, that what we do out there is no longer in the dark as it was when we sent our explorers to America. What they decided to do, they were here on their own. It took, you know, months and months to get some feedback. But now we can actually see them and deal with them and send communication in real time. And I just wanted to point out that I think planetary ethics that we now have the ability to encourage and formulate changes in real time based on feedback, because people aren't in the dark anymore. There's a two-way street to exploration. That's just my comment.
Very good point. All right, that's my time. Thank you so much.